Hi, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, a show about the world of work and our place in it. The climate change threat has reached new urgent levels. As we speak, India, Asia's third biggest economy, is facing weeks of record temperatures. And according to a study in the journal Science, runaway climate change is on pace to cause mass extinction on ocean life. As more countries join the coalition to commit to net zero emissions by 2050, we here at LinkedIn News want to know how the labor market will play into these goals and what's needed to achieve more green jobs. My next two guests recently completed a study about that. Joining me now is Niels Jacob Hansen. He is an economist at the International Monetary Fund for the past 6 years. His research includes monetary and labor market issues, and he co-authored the report we're going to discuss. He received his PhD from the University of Stockholm, his master's from the University of Cambridge, and the University of Copenhagen. Niels Jacob, welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Also joining me is John Bludorn. He is Deputy Division Chief on the World Economic Outlook Division in the Research Department at the International Monetary Fund, where he's been for the past 11 years. Prior to that, he was a lecturer in economics at the University of Southampton. He received his PhD at UC Berkeley and his AB at the University of Missouri. John, good to have you as well on the show.
Good to see you. Thank you.
John, I'll start with you. When we talk about green jobs, what exactly are we talking about?
So when we look at green jobs in our report, what we're talking about are what is the nature of the work that workers are doing. So are the kinds of tasks that they're involved, do they involve tasks that directly affect or are related to environmental sustainability, reducing pollution, or helping basically to improve that sustainability, the reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that kind of those kind of tasks. And the more of those tasks that are involved in a job, the greener we say that job is. And so that's what we mean when we talk about green jobs. It's really, instead of it being kind of a either or, you're either green or you're not, it's actually a continuum. And so we construct a measure called green intensity, or that we call green intensity, that we're actually able to assign to each occupation according to a standard industrial classification scheme that we use. And in that way, we can look then at people who are employed in a country or a sector and assess kind of what's their green intensity on average, or for any individual worker, what's their occupational green intensity.
So then for context for our viewers, a green job doesn't necessarily mean you're out there planting trees. It just means it's less pollution intensive than other jobs, for example. Is that correct?
So that's one aspect. Yeah, it can involve, but it could also involve maybe I'm in the power sector, and one of the tasks that I do as my job is help arrange for the installation of, say, renewable energy, wind turbines, this kind of stuff. So that would be kind of maybe one task as part of a broader set of tasks that I do on my job, and that contributes to making my job greener.
NJ, I want to ask you, according to the report, in order for the economy to become more green, it seems like the labor market needs to lead the way. Currently, what is stopping that from happening?
So what we are doing in the report is that we are trying to see what kind of policies can you put in place to get a greener labor market. And what we find is that countries that generally have a more stringent level of environmental policies in place, that can be, for example, carbon prices, but it can also be other policies that are pushing towards greener labor market, and it's also spending on research and development in greener technologies. And what we find is that those countries are, on average, have more green labor markets, in the sense that they have, on average, jobs that are more green, less polluting, and also lower emission than countries that do not have those policies in place. And also maybe important to say here is that those kind of policies that we are looking at here, they interact with the structural they potentially interact with the structural features of the economy. So, for example, what we are finding is that countries that have more retention policies in place, though those countries see less effect when you put these greener policies in place. And that could be because that these retention policy potentially inhibits the reallocation towards these greener jobs. So policies can help, but they can help more if the right structural features of the economies are also in place at the same time.
I do want to talk about policy in just a moment. Let's focus on the businesses right now. Are businesses apprehensive about making the investment into being more green? Because I imagine that it is quite a hefty investment into transitioning. And if they are apprehensive, is it just the monetary aspect of it, or what's behind it? Either John or NJ.
Okay, maybe I'll start a little bit and John can jump in. So what we are seeing is that over the time period that we're studying, which is fairly recently, jobs are on average becoming greener and less pollution intensive and also less emitting for the set of countries that we are studying, important to say. But it's happening at a pretty glacial pace. It's not going very fast. So that's also why, we will come back to talk about policies in a moment, but we think like putting policies in place or committing to policies that will be put in place in the future can create very important incentives for companies to start making the investments that are needed today.
Yeah, maybe to jump in a little bit just on that. I think that that's actually one of the key, motivators perhaps for businesses is looking ahead, having a little bit more certainty about what the policies that are going to be out there to help encourage a greener economy, if those can be committed to by governments and are predictable over the next, if you have to make long-term investments the next 10 to 20 years, if you have a bit of a sense of that, then that makes the investment choice easier today. And so you can get started on that green transition in a more quickly.
I want to pause the conversation very quickly and say hi to some folks who are joining us from all over the world. We've got Luca from Italy, Deanna from Chicago, Luana from Michigan, and Anna from Romania. Thank you for joining the show and for watching. If you have any questions, we're speaking with economists at the IMF discussing the greening of the economy, making the labor market more green and what's needed for that. Let's address COVID, of course. Would you say that COVID has accelerated or decelerated the labor market greening? John, why don't you answer?
Sure, I can jump in on that. So we do have an analysis in the chapter that looks at kind of what's happened post-COVID. We had this big shock that occurred in March 2020, shutdowns, a lot everywhere, all kinds of disruptions to the economy at large and to labor markets and to workers' lives. And in a box where we use actually high frequency data on job postings and worker profiles from LinkedIn in part, what we see is that greener jobs, measured by that green intensity metric that we mentioned before, those actually tended to hold up better in the wake of the COVID-19 shock. And meaning that the labor market conditions for workers that had those kind of jobs, they tended to be able to hold on to those, and hiring rates tended to actually be a bit better for those kind of jobs than for other kinds of jobs. Now, more recent. So sorry, go ahead.
Why is that?
We don't know exactly.
Is it too early to tell? Because we're still sort of in COVID, I suppose.
We are. But what's happened more recently is that near-term difference between greener jobs and not as green jobs has actually kind of closed in terms of the hiring rates. And that reflects that more recently, there's been a stronger labor market recovery more broadly. And so, but earlier on, one possible story, we didn't investigate this, so this is really a bit more speculative, is that, businesses know that there is going to be this green transition coming, and so it's important for them to maintain a workforce that's going to be able to kind of address that, regardless of what other kinds of shocks are happening in the economy. And so that could be well one reason why we see that differential that was there in say 2020 But like I said, that's kind of narrowed a fair bit more recently, and we see more similar kind of hiring rates into green and not so green jobs.
And how easy is it for someone who works in a non-green intensive job to transition into a more green intensive job?
Maybe I'll jump in here. So that's actually one of the key questions that we looked at, because if we're talking about greening the economy, we would like to know how hard is it for someone who's working in a very polluting industry, for example, mining, to move to a job that involves greener tasks, for example, putting up windmills, just to make an extreme example. And what we are finding there is that at the individual levels, those transitions tend to be quite hard. So to give you some specific numbers, what we are finding is that when you if you are already in a green intensive job and you're moving to and you're moving jobs, then the probability of staying in a green intensive job is pretty high, around 40 to 50%. However, if you are coming from a pollution intensive job and you're moving jobs, then the probability of moving to a green intensive job is much lower, at less than 10%. So that means that, if you're not already green, it's hard to become green. And of course, that's a challenge for policymakers as well, in the sense that we want to make sure that we are moving to a green economy, but we also want to make sure that when we are moving to that green economy, that it's an inclusive economy, and that we will not end up having high increases in inequality because we are greening the economy. So that's something to be aware of, that these transitions at the individual levels can be quite tough.
And what exactly is it that makes it so tough? Is it the lack of skills? Is that it, or? Right.
I think this in some sense is echoing other findings from the literature. We know in general just changing occupation is tough, because you would be moving from doing a certain types of job, and then you have to do something else. What we are finding is that the transition can be easier if you have more skills. So in that sense, that's kind of an argument for making sure that you have a more educated workforce. But it's also one of the reasons why, when we are moving to the policy package, which we may talk a little bit about more later, is that we are saying that a very important part of that policy package to green economy is making sure that you are providing training to lower skills workers so that they can move more easily to this more green economy.
Okay, I get it. We want to talk policy. I get it. Well, and I do have a question quickly from Lisa from Colorado before we get to policy. Lisa from Colorado asks, what are some pros and cons of transitioning into a greener job? Is that something that either of you could answer?
Sure. Well, one of the things is we see some different, when we compare more green intensive versus, say, more pollution intensive jobs, we do see some differences. One of the important ones is that actually the average green intensive job commands an earnings premium of about 7% compared to the average pollution intensive job. So that's, basically suggests that with greener jobs, there's a better chance that you're going to be earning more. The other is that we see that something we call separation rates, so meaning how readily jobs end, whether from the employer or employee choice. Greener jobs tend to have a lower rate of separation than do less green intensive or more pollution intensive jobs.
Sorry, can you specify exactly what that means? A lower, does that mean a higher retention rate?
Yeah, or you might, their jobs seem to be more secure.
Great.
Those greener jobs tend to be more secure.
Okay, so let's talk about policy now. When I think of policy, I tend to think about regulation, which sometimes gets a bad rap for stifling business growth. Two questions. One is, have you found that to be true specifically in this area that you guys have studied? And secondly, what kind of policies would help sort of with these transitions from a less green job to a more green job that you guys have found? Let's start with NJ.
Right. So, we are tackling that question from kind of two angles. The first angle is that we are looking at the cross-country evidence. And there we have this aggregate measure of how stringent environmental policies are. And that involves whether or not you have a CO2 tax in place, also how stringent your other environmental policies are, and also whether or not you're spending money on research in renewables, for example. And what we are finding there is that countries that have those kind of policies in place, they do on average see a greener labor market. So that's a piece of evidence pointing in the direction that these policies can help when it comes to green the labor market. But I will say, like, as an overall point, that the purpose of these policies is really to make sure that you get the incentives right for businesses, right? I mean, the carbon tax is a good example, right? A carbon tax is addressing this thing that we, as economists, call externalities, right? That there are some costs involved in the production of goods that are not always fully put into the cost of producing those goods. So by putting this carbon tax in place, you're making that cost more visible, and that's then creating incentive for the companies and the economy to act in a way that is more sustainable for the environment. So policies can help, but obviously it needs to be the right policies.
Are you finding that businesses, like when there are these sort of policies like these taxes, these carbon taxes, is there a lot of pushback, or do you feel like businesses are overall sort of adopting these new changes?
So this is not a question that we study per se. I mean, obviously, one thing I guess just John was also alluding to before, what kind of policies that are expected in the future is key inputs to the decisions that businesses are making today. So in some sense, creating more certainty about which carbon prices you will have in the future and what are the path for those carbon prices. Getting certainty about that could actually help make the business decisions easier and more
secure,
more foreseeable for the businesses. And in that sense, that could be helpful.
It's the fuzziness of it and the potential that it could change depending on the administration that makes it hard to plan for the future for some of these businesses, I imagine. And you, NJ, you mentioned production. John, I want to ask you, let's take the industrial sector, for example, a very high polluting job. How is there a way to make, say, the industrial sector less polluting in a way that doesn't have an adverse impact on the economy?
So this is a super important question. And it's one that's reflected in the advice we try to put out there, which is you really need a policy package. So it's not just going to be, say, a carbon price or something equivalent in terms of, say, regulation that could achieve the similar kind of cost signal that we would like a carbon price to deliver. But it's also green infrastructure investment, green R&D investment. It's also actually ensuring that for workers on the worker side, that say lower income workers, it could be something like an earned income tax credit to encourage them to stay in the job market even while there's transitions happening, make it more appealing for them. And then the final kind of piece is policies for retraining. Recognizing that for some workers, it may be tougher to make a transition into a greener job, in particular those from, say, like more polluting sectors, like mining, some manufacturing processes, these kinds of things. That there is kind of training programs that are out there that actually can be targeted to those specific sectors to help workers in those sectors acquire the skill sets that they need to be able to move into those greener jobs. And actually, one thing that's important to note is that actually a lot of those greener jobs are actually in those same sectors. So for example, you're in a manufacturing facility and there's the signals coming from the policy environment and it's a priority to start becoming greener. Well, that changes the nature of some of the jobs that are being done, say, in a given factory or something. And so then it's just, some of that training is about turning more pollution-intensive jobs into greener jobs in some cases. Some pollution-intensive jobs get eliminated, and then those we need to make sure that there's growth in those more green intensive jobs, and that workers have the skill sets needed to be able to take those on.
So workers don't necessarily have to leave, for example, even the company. They could just rescale and find greener jobs within that company. That's great. Let's say I had a couple other folks joining us. Michael from Pennsylvania, Gail from Barbados, Eslam from Egypt. Thanks for joining. And we have a question from Karen. She's asking, what is the biggest expense in the effort to transition to green jobs or to the green arena? NJ or John, feel free to answer that one. What is the biggest expense in the effort to transition to green? Would you say, is it the rescaling? Is it the... Mm-hmm.
I think so. We didn't kind of go through and do a specific costing, I guess, shall we say, for the different elements. One important thing to remember is that as part of the policy package, so we put in place this carbon tax, which actually generates some revenue, which is then turned around to help fund some of the green infrastructure investment, the green R&D, as well as the retraining. And so I guess an important message from the study, one important message from the study is that the package can be structured in such a way so that, the government is obeying kind of its budget constraints over the, this kind of 10 to 30 year horizon that we're talking about.
And I do actually want to go back to something that you'd mentioned earlier about the retention rate, that the retention rate tends to be higher in green intensive jobs than in non-green intensive jobs. Can we sort of dig into why that is? NJ.
I think it's not something that we have studied very carefully, so I'm not sure we have a very precise answer on it. I mean, you can speculate in the sense that that this is an area that is, and we do see movements towards a greener economy in the data. Although for the time period that we're studying, we're still talking about relatively low numbers in the sense that most of the jobs in the economy have very little green skills, but there is growth. So in that sense, that it's a growing part of the economy, getting people into those jobs and making and them staying there makes sense. So the fact that it's a growing part of the economy could be part of the explanation for why we're seeing it.
Or maybe even because it's perhaps healthier as well. That it's perhaps less, you're exposed perhaps to less pollutions and it pays better. I mean, we can speculate all we want.
Yeah,
I know you guys are economists. I don't want to put you on the table to speculate. Before we go, I do want to ask the both of you. We'll start with John. Just some of the most surprising findings from your report as you were doing this study. What sort of jumped out at you and that kind of made you think, I never thought of that?
So I think one was when we really went and started trying to quantify how green is the labor market currently and how polluting are kind of the work that workers are doing. What you find is that the share of the vast bulk of the jobs that workers do are neutral, meaning that they're neither really green intensive nor are they really pollution intensive, and that actually a lot of the kind of pollution emissions are coming from a relatively small number of jobs. And similarly, it's not like everybody needs to be doing green tasks and stuff. It's much more that probably the bigger challenge is going to be changing, to use an economist term, the capital structure of the economy rather than the labor market. And in fact, when we look at the labor market transition that potentially is needed to get on that and achieve that net zero emissions by 2050 path, we see that for, say, an average advanced economy, about 1% of employment would need to shift, say, from higher emitting to lower emitting work. And to put that in context, when we look at the overall shift in labor that's occurred as we've had a growth of the service sector and the industry has tended to shrink, that has been at usually a rate of about 4% per decade. And so this is a lot smaller magnitude of overall macro shift of the workforce than, say, we've already experienced in the past through kind of just natural market forces encouraging growth of services.
And Jay, what about you?
Yeah, I would say what John mentioned, that this kind of seems to manageable at the macro level. That was a positive surprise. That then, of course, also that there are these challenges at the micro level that we talked about, that is hard to become greener. I mean, one more thing that I would say is interesting that comes out of this is that there, like you were talking about before, that there are many margins of adjustment. It's not just necessarily moving people from one sector to another. There's also within each sector scope for moving up the greenness ladder and down the pollution ladder, so to speak. So then there are really many margins that can operate and bring us towards this greener economy. So I think that was also something that came out of this. That was a surprise.
Well, I appreciate both of you spending time with us today and helping us sort of unpack this study that you guys have done. So thank you very much for explaining it all to us.
Thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
That was Niels Jacob Hansen and John Bludorn, both economists at the IMF. And thank you for those of you who joined live on the stream. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions and comments. You can continue the conversation here. You can check out some of our other stories to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, of course, click into the search box. I'll see you next week. I'm Nina Melendez. Thank you so much for watching LinkedIn News Live.